Sir, let me take a look at your ID for a moment.
What's the reason for that?
Just a standard check. That vehicle outside caught my attention.
I'm only here for a car wash. Am I being stopped for something?
That's a pretty expensive vehicle. How'd you manage that? Cars like that often get stolen.
I'm in law enforcement.
I find that hard to believe.
Don't let this grow worse. I work for that.
The body camera footage that came out of this story will make you put your phone down and stare at the wall. A white police officer walked into a Miami car wash on a sunny Friday afternoon, spotted a brand new 2025 Mercedes G-Wagon gleaming under the detail bay lights, and struck up a conversation with the shift manager about it. He was relaxed. He was chatting. He looked like an officer killing 20 minutes on a slow afternoon, genuinely impressed by a beautiful vehicle. But the moment the shift manager nodded toward the black man sitting alone in the waiting area and said the G-Wagon belonged to him, something moved across Officer Zachary Bennett's face that the body camera captured in the kind of detail that makes later denials impossible. His posture changed, his tone changed, and what he did in the next 14 minutes was so transparently, so completely without any legitimate basis that it would not only end his career, it would expose a pattern of conduct that his department had been quietly absorbing for 6 years without once asking what it added up to. The worst part for Bennett, he had forgotten his own body camera was running the entire time. Before we go any further, drop your city or country in the comments right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it before this video ends. Stories like this one need to be told, and your support is what makes that possible. Now let's get into exactly what happened. The car wash was called Crystal Clear Detail, a well-known premium detailing spot on the north side of Miami, the kind of establishment where the waiting list for a full interior and exterior package ran 2 weeks out, and the lot on any given Friday afternoon looked like the parking section of a luxury auto show. Bentleys, G-Wagons, Porsche SUVs, the kind of vehicles that attracted the kind of clientele that expected discretion, professionalism, and results. The staff knew their regulars by name and by vehicle. The shift manager had been running the Friday afternoon rotation for 3 years without incident. On this particular Friday, the lot was operating at full capacity. 8 vehicles in various stages of the detailing process, 4 workers moving between them with the coordinated efficiency of a team that had done this enough times to make it look effortless. Inside the air-conditioned waiting area, a clean, well-lit room with leather chairs, a flat screen, and a glass wall overlooking the lot, sat a single customer. He was in his late 30s, wearing a dark hoodie, comfortable pants, and clean sneakers, a cup of coffee in his hand that he'd been working through slowly since he arrived. He was moving between his phone and a tablet on his lap with the focused, unhurried energy of someone who had learned to use waiting time productively. He looked, to anyone passing the glass wall, like a man in a hoodie with a nice car waiting for it to be finished. Unremarkable, routine, exactly like every other customer in every other chair on every other Friday afternoon. His name was Kendrick Moore, and Kendrick Moore was anything but routine. Kendrick had spent 16 years as a federal agent, assigned to the Financial Crimes and Money Laundering Division of a federal enforcement agency whose reach extended across 12 states and whose investigations had dismantled 3 of the largest illicit financial networks operating through South Florida in the previous decade. He had worked cases that required him to move in circles where the wrong name dropped at the wrong moment could end an operation and endanger a life. He had received 2 directorial commendations. He had been deposed as an expert witness in federal proceedings on 4 separate occasions. He knew financial crime the way surgeons know anatomy, not as a subject, but as a landscape he had been navigating long enough to read it without a map. That Friday afternoon, none of it was on display. He was just a man in a dark hoodie, sipping coffee, waiting for his G-Wagon. Officer Zachary Bennett had been with the Miami Police Department for 6 years. His personnel file described him in the language that personnel files use when they are trying to be accurate without being alarming. Assertive in enforcement situations, demonstrates initiative in identifying potential concerns, proactive in community engagement. What the personnel file also contained, in a separate section that required a formal records request to access, were 9 civilian complaints filed over 6 years. 7 of the 9 involved black male subjects. All 9 had been reviewed individually. All 9 had been closed without disciplinary action. No one had ever been asked to look at all 9 at once and explain what the pattern meant. He had stopped at Crystal Clear Detail to ask the shift manager about a noise complaint from a neighboring business, a routine inquiry that should have taken 4 minutes and left no record worth examining. He had admired the G-Wagon under the bay lights. He had asked whose it was. The shift manager pointed to the waiting area. Bennett looked through the glass wall at Kendrick Moore in the dark hoodie, coffee cup in hand, tablet on his lap, with the focused, unhurried energy of someone who had learned to use waiting time productively. He looked, to anyone passing the glass wall, like a man in a hoodie with a nice car waiting for it to be finished. Unremarkable, routine, exactly like every other customer in every other chair on every other Friday afternoon. Crystal Clear Detail ran on reputation. Not advertising, not social media presence, not the kind of promotional effort that newer businesses depended on to fill their schedules. Reputation. Built over 11 years of consistent work on vehicles that their owners cared about enough to be particular about. Spread through the specific word-of-mouth network of people who owned things worth protecting and had learned, through the occasional disappointing experience elsewhere, that premium results required premium attention. The waiting list for a full detail package was 2 weeks on a slow month. On a busy one, you called ahead and hoped. The Friday afternoon rotation was the week's peak. By 2 o'clock, the lot carried the particular energy of a place operating at exactly its capacity. Organized, focused, every worker moving with the efficiency of someone who knew their role in a choreography that had been refined through repetition. The air smelled of cleaning solution and fresh wax, and the faint exhaust of engines being started and moved between stations. Music played from a portable speaker near the vacuum bay, low enough to work over, present enough to set a pace. The vehicles in the lot that afternoon represented the specific cross-section of Miami wealth that Crystal Clear had built its clientele from. A pearl-white Bentley Bentayga in the rinse bay, a blacked-out Porsche Cayenne waiting for interior work, a champagne-colored Range Rover already in the drying stage. The kind of lot that made people slow down when they drove past, not because anything unusual was happening, but because the concentration of extraordinary machinery in one place had a gravitational quality that was difficult to move past without acknowledging. And then there was the 2025 Mercedes G-Wagon. Matte black, the kind of finish that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, giving the vehicle a presence that was less about shine and more about weight, the visual weight of something that had been designed to communicate permanence. It sat in the premium detail bay at the center of the lot, 2 workers moving around it with the careful attention that the finish required, their movements slower and more deliberate than anywhere else in the rotation. It was the kind of vehicle that made other expensive vehicles look like they were still trying. Officer Zachary Bennett had pulled into the Crystal Clear lot at 2:23 p.m. to follow up on a noise complaint from the dry cleaning business next door. A minor, administrative errand that required a conversation with the manager and a notation in his daily log. Nothing that warranted extended attention. He had done it 100 times at 100 different businesses, and the outcome was always the same. A brief exchange, an acknowledgement, a logged entry, and back to patrol. He saw the G-Wagon when he stepped out of his cruiser. His body camera was already running. He stood beside his car for a moment longer than the errand required, looking at the matte black finish the way people look at things that stop them without asking permission. Then he walked toward the shift manager with the easy, unhurried stride of a man who had nothing particular on his mind. That was the last true thing about the next 14 minutes. The shift manager's name was Carlos. 11 years at Crystal Clear, the last 4 running the Friday rotation with the particular authority of someone who had earned his position through consistency rather than title. He knew every vehicle in the lot by owner, by service package, by the specific preferences each customer had communicated over time. He knew which clients wanted updates while they waited and which ones preferred to be left alone. He knew the lot the way people know places they have given a significant portion of their working life to. not as an environment to be managed, but as a system whose rhythms they had become fluent in. When Bennett walked over from his cruiser, Carlos met him with the professional courtesy he extended to everyone who came through the lot, direct, efficient, attentive without being deferential. They handled the noise complaint in approximately 3 minutes. Bennett made a notation. Carlos confirmed the business's operating hours and the sound equipment specifications. The exchange was exactly what it was supposed to be: brief, documented, unremarkable. Then, Bennett looked toward the premium detail bay and asked about the G-Wagon. Carlos told him it was a customer vehicle in for a full exterior package. The matte finish required a specific product line and a slower application process than standard paint. Bennett nodded, the body camera recording his profile as he looked at the vehicle with the same arrested attention he'd shown stepping out of his cruiser. He said something about the color. Carlos agreed it was striking. They stood there for a moment in the uncomplicated appreciation of two people looking at something that merited looking at. Then, Bennett asked whose it was. Carlos glanced toward the waiting area, the glass-walled room visible from the detail bay, where Kendrick Moore sat in the leather chair closest to the window. Dark hoodie, coffee cup, tablet on his lap, entirely absorbed in whatever was on the screen in front of him. Carlos nodded in that direction and said the G-Wagon belonged to the gentleman inside. What happened to Bennett's face in the 2 seconds following that sentence was captured by his body camera in the kind of resolution that removes interpretive flexibility. It was not a dramatic transformation, not the cartoonish villain expression that people imagine when they describe this kind of moment. It was subtler and therefore more revealing. The relaxed openness that had characterized his expression during the noise complaint exchange and the car conversation closed. Not all at once, but in the specific sequence of a face whose owner has received information that conflicts with an existing framework and is processing the conflict in real time. The eyes narrowed slightly, the jaw set. The easy, unhurried quality of his posture was replaced by something more deliberate. The mask didn't fall. It slipped. Just enough to show what was underneath it, and just enough for a body camera positioned at chest height to record the slip in the kind of detail that a courtroom would later find impossible to argue around. Carlos noticed. He had been reading customers and situations for 11 years, and he noticed the shift, the way experienced people notice things, without reacting to them immediately, filing them away, watching to see what they produced. He had seen enough to know that the conversation had just changed categories. He just didn't know yet how far the new category was going to go. Bennett looked through the glass wall at Kendrick Moore for a moment. Then he thanked Carlos for his time and walked toward the waiting area entrance. The noise complaint was closed. Something else had opened, and the body camera was still running. Bennett walked into the waiting area like he owned the square footage. Not aggressively. That came later. In the first 30 seconds, his entry had the calibrated casualness of someone who had decided on an approach before reaching the door and was executing it with the practiced ease of an officer who had done this particular kind of thing enough times that it no longer required conscious construction. He looked around the room with the brief, scanning attention of someone performing a survey, even though there was only one person in it. Then he settled his gaze on Kendrick Moore and moved toward him. Kendrick looked up from his tablet. He pulled one earbud out. The unhurried, single earbud removal of someone who expects the interruption to be brief and isn't prepared to commit both ears to it yet. He looked at Bennett with the expression of a man who has just been approached by a police officer in a car wash waiting room and is running a rapid professional assessment of what category of encounter this is going to turn out to be. Bennett told him it was a routine check. He said the word routine the way people say words they have chosen specifically because the words are designed to preempt questions rather than answer them. Routine was doing a lot of work in that sentence. It was supposed to communicate normalcy, procedure, the unremarkable machinery of law enforcement moving through its standard functions. What it actually communicated, to anyone listening carefully, was the absence of a specific reason, because officers who have specific reasons tend to lead with them. Kendrick asked what the check was for. Bennett said he was verifying the ownership of vehicles on the lot, a property verification, completely standard. He said it with the smooth delivery of someone who had constructed the justification on the walk from the detail bay and was presenting it now as though it had existed before the G-Wagon did. Kendrick looked at him for a moment without responding, the way you look at something when you are deciding how much of what you actually think to say out loud. Then he confirmed that the G-Wagon was his and that it was currently being detailed, which the workers visible through the glass wall could confirm if verification was genuinely what this was about. Bennett asked how long he had owned it. Kendrick told him. Bennett asked what he did for work. This was the question that changed the temperature of the room, not because it was delivered aggressively. It wasn't, not yet, but because it had no relationship to vehicle ownership verification that any honest accounting of the situation could produce. The G-Wagon's registration, its insurance, its ownership history were all verified through a license plate query that Bennett had not run and had not asked to run. The question of what Kendrick did for work was not a property verification question. It was the question underneath the property verification question, the one Bennett actually wanted answered, stripped of its procedural disguise. Kendrick set his tablet down on the chair beside him, both earbuds out now. He looked at Bennett with the full, undivided attention of someone who had just decided that this conversation required his complete focus. He asked Bennett, in a tone that was professionally lisvil and surgically precise, what his occupation had to do with whether his car was legally parked in a detailing bay. Bennett said he was just making conversation. Kendrick said it didn't feel like conversation. It felt like an income audit conducted without a warrant in a car wash waiting room on a Friday afternoon, and he would appreciate knowing the actual basis for the interaction before it continued any further. The body camera caught Bennett's jaw tighten for the second time in 14 minutes. The first time had been through the glass wall when Carlos pointed at the waiting area. This time was closer, clearer, and considerably more difficult to attribute to anything other than the specific frustration of a man whose constructed justification had just been identified, named, and declined by someone sitting in a leather chair with a coffee cup who hadn't raised his voice once. Kendrick reached into the front pocket of his hoodie slowly and deliberately. Not because the movement required slowness. Retrieving a credential folio from a front pocket is mechanically simple, but because 16 years of federal work had built into him the specific discipline of making every motion in a tense situation legible to whoever was watching, visible, unambiguous. The kind of movement that gives a running body camera nothing to misrepresent and no subsequent report anything to reframe. He produced the credential folio and opened it in a single practiced motion. He held it at a level where Bennett could read every detail without leaning forward. The photograph, the badge, the agency seal, his name, his designation, his division assignment, all of it printed in the specific format and security features of a federal credential that 16 years of service had earned him and that no amount of skepticism could make disappear. He said it the same way he said everything, level, unhurried, without the performance of someone who needed the words to land dramatically. They were simply true, and true things don't require theatrical delivery. I am a federal agent. Bennett looked at the credential folio. He looked at it the way people look at information that contradicts a conclusion they have already committed to, not with the open curiosity of someone receiving new data, but with the particular narrowed attention of someone searching the data for the flaw that will allow them to dismiss it. He studied the photograph. He looked at Kendrick. He looked at the badge. He looked at the agency seal. Then he said it wasn't the first time he'd seen a fake federal badge. The body camera captured the statement in audio clean enough to be played without amplification in a federal proceeding, which is exactly where it would eventually be played. Kendrick absorbed it with the stillness of someone who has spent 16 years in rooms where composure was not a personality trait, but a professional requirement. He did not react to the word fake with anything visible. He simply held the credential folio open and told Bennett that the agency's verification line was printed on the back of the credential and that a 60-second phone call would resolve every question Bennett was performing rather than asking. Bennett said he didn't need to make any calls. This is where hubris reveals its architecture most clearly, not in the initial assumption, which can at least claim the defense of ignorance, but in the moment after the correction arrives and gets refused. Bennett had been given the credential. He had been given the verification number. He had been offered the 60-second resolution that would have ended the encounter, closed the body camera chapter, and sent both of them back to their respective Friday afternoons without consequence. He looked at all of it and decided his instinct outranked the evidence. He told Kendrick the credential looked like it could be purchased online. Kendrick closed the folio. He set it on his knee with the deliberate care of someone preserving an exhibit. He picked up his coffee cup and took a measured sip, not as a performance of calm, but as the actual behavior of a man who had decided that the next move was not his to make. He had identified himself, he had produced documentation, he had offered verification, he had done everything the situation required of him, and several things it didn't. What happened next was entirely Bennett's construction, every brick of it, on a running body camera, in a car wash waiting room in Miami on a Friday afternoon, in front of a glass wall behind which Carlos was watching from the detail bay with the expression of a man who had been reading situations for 11 years and knew with complete certainty that the one unfolding on the other side of the glass was going to end somewhere that nobody in this room was going to enjoy, except possibly the federal jury,
8 months from now, when the body camera footage was played without editing or interruption, and Bennett's own words filled a silent courtroom with the specific, irreversible sound of a man who had been given every exit and chosen none of them. It was the reflection that gave it away. The waiting area's glass wall, the one facing the detail bay where the G-Wagon sat under careful hands, caught the light at an angle that the room's interior design had not accounted for when the afternoon sun moved to its Friday position. At 2:47 p.m., the glass functioned less as a window and more as a mirror, throwing a partial reflection of the waiting area back at itself. Bennett caught his own image in it during a half-second pause in the conversation, and what he saw in that reflection, mounted on his own chest, was the small, steady red light of a body camera that had been recording since he stepped out of his cruiser 47 minutes earlier and had not stopped once. The change was not dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was the specific, contained stillness of a man whose internal calculation has just been completely revised in the time it takes to register a reflected light. His eyes moved from the glass back to Kendrick, then down to the camera, then back up, and what was in his expression when they came back up was not guilt in the way that guilt is usually performed for an audience. It was the private, functional version of it, the kind that arrives not as an emotion but as a logistical problem requiring immediate management. He shifted his weight. The body camera captured the shift. His tone changed first, before his words, before any explicit acknowledgement of what the reflection had just shown him. The clipped interrogative quality that had characterized the previous 12 minutes softened at its edges in the specific way that a person's tone softens when they have decided mid-conversation that the conversation needs to be something other than what it had been. He said something about appreciating Chemic's patience. The body camera captured the sentence immediately after capturing everything that had preceded it, which meant the appreciation landed in a context that made it considerably less appreciative than the words alone might have suggested.
Kendrick watched the adjustment happen with the unhurried attention of someone who had spent 16 years interviewing people who were recalibrating in real time and had developed an extremely reliable sense for when recalibration was genuine and when it was damage control dressed in a different register. This was the second kind. Bennett said he hoped there were no hard feelings. He said it with the particular phrasing of someone who is hoping that the phrase itself will function as an erasure, that no hard feelings will retroactively reclassify the previous 12 minutes as a misunderstanding, rather than a documented sequence of a federal credential being dismissed as a potential online purchase, while a body camera recorded every syllable. Kendrick picked up his tablet. He looked at it briefly. Then he looked at Bennett with the expression he had been wearing since the first earbud came out. Steady, patient, entirely unimpressed, and said something that the body camera captured with the same fidelity it had applied to everything else. He said that hard feelings weren't the issue. He said that what was on that camera was the issue, and that he suspected Bennett already knew that, given that the temperature of the room had changed approximately 30 seconds after Bennett looked at his own reflection in the glass. The detail bay was visible through the window behind Kendrick's shoulder. The G-Wagon was nearly finished, workers moving through the final stage with the careful, methodical attention the matte finish required. Carlos was standing near the bay entrance, not pretending to be busy with anything else, watching the waiting area with the direct, unblinking focus of someone who had made a decision about what he was witnessing and intended to be available as a witness to it. Bennett had entered the waiting area with a constructed justification and a working assumption and the easy confidence of someone who had operated on both for 6 years without meaningful consequence. He was leaving it with a running body camera, a federal agent's direct assessment of what was on it, and the specific, hollow feeling of a man who had just understood, not gradually, not in stages, but all at once, that the 60-second verification call he had refused was going to seem, in retrospect, like the most reasonable thing anyone had ever offered him. He said he was going to step outside for a moment. Kendrick told him that was fine. His car would be ready in approximately 8 minutes. He put both earbuds back in, picked up his coffee, and returned his attention to the tablet with the unhurried composure of a man who had nowhere to be and nothing left to prove, and every reason to let the body camera finish doing the work that Bennett's refusal to verify had started. The footage was reviewed at the precinct by Monday morning, not because someone filed a complaint over the weekend, though the complaint had been filed, formally and in writing, by Kendrick Moore's attorney at 9:17 a.m. on Saturday, approximately 18 hours after the G-Wagon left crystal clear detail with a finish that Carlos's team had spent 3 hours protecting. The footage was reviewed Monday morning because the precinct's internal affairs supervisor had received a call on Friday evening from a number he recognized as the regional field office of a federal agency, and the person on the other end of that call had been professional, precise, and entirely clear about the nature of what the body camera footage contained and the timeline within which the department would be expected to respond to it. The internal affairs supervisor watched the footage twice before calling the chief. The chief watched it once. He was a 27-year veteran who had navigated enough institutional crises to recognize immediately the difference between an incident that could be managed through the standard review process and an incident that had already left the standard review process behind and was operating in a different jurisdiction entirely. The body camera footage fell into the second category with a completeness that left no procedural ambiguity. A federal agent's credentials dismissed as a potential online purchase, a verification call refused on camera, 12 minutes of documented conduct that no internal affairs framework was going to reframe into anything resembling acceptable procedure. He called Bennett into his office at 8:34 a.m. The meeting lasted 11 minutes, shorter than the incident that produced it. Bennett arrived with the specific energy of someone who had spent the weekend constructing a version of Friday afternoon that he considered presentable and was prepared to deliver it. The chief let him begin. He listened for approximately 90 seconds. Then he turned his monitor toward Bennett and pressed play. They watched it together in silence. When it finished, the chief told Bennett that the department had a narrow window between the current moment and the filing of a federal civil rights lawsuit that would name the city, the precinct, and Bennett personally, and that the window's only viable exit was a termination that demonstrated the department's position clearly enough to be legible to the Federal Oversight Board already reviewing the footage. Bennett's badge was on the desk before the monitor screen went dark. Kendrick Moore returned to work on Monday. Not after extended leave, not after a period of processing that required time away from the job. Monday morning, same desk, same division, same cases that had been running before Friday afternoon interrupted a car wash appointment and produced a body camera record that a federal oversight board was already reviewing. He was the same agent he had been on Thursday. The credential folio was in the same pocket. The 16 years were still 16 years. Nothing about his professional identity had been altered by what Bennett had decided in a car wash waiting room, and he had made a conscious, deliberate choice not to let the incident construct a version of himself that required recovery. That choice was itself a kind of statement, not a public one, not the kind that gets delivered at press conferences or quoted in news coverage, the private kind. The decision a person makes about how much space they are willing to give a moment that was never supposed to have any power over them in the first place. The civil complaint moved through the federal system with the steady, procedural momentum of a case whose evidence required no embellishment. Bennett's termination was entered into the record. The 9 prior complaints, reviewed as a pattern for the first time, were entered into the record. The body camera footage was entered into the record. The case settled before it reached trial, the city's legal team having reviewed the same footage the chief had watched on Monday morning and arrived at the same conclusion in approximately the same amount of time. The settlement figure was not disclosed. The terms required departmental bias training, revised protocols for officer conduct in civilian commercial spaces, and a formal review mechanism for complaint patterns that had previously been evaluated only in isolation. But here is the thing that no settlement figure addresses and no policy revision resolves. The thing that Kendrick Moore understood on Friday afternoon in a leather chair with a coffee cup, and that the story leaves behind after the body camera footage is filed and the badge is on the desk and the chief's monitor goes dark. 16 years of federal service did not change what Bennett saw when Carlos pointed at the waiting area. 2 directorial commendations did not change it. The credential folio did not change it. The G-Wagon did not change it, and the hoodie did not change it, and nothing in the waiting room changed it, because the assumption that Bennett carried through that door was not about any of those things. It was about the skin of the man sitting in the chair. And achievement, however real and however hard-earned, has never functioned as a shield against that particular kind of vision. It just changes what happens after. It changes who has the resources to make the body camera footage matter. It changes whether the pattern gets named, and whether the settlement gets filed, and whether the 9 prior complaints get read as a sequence instead of 9 separate stories that happen to involve 9 different people. It does not change what the officer saw when he walked through the door. That is the part that belongs to a conversation larger than one car wash, one Friday afternoon, one matte black G-Wagon sitting in a detail bay while its owner waited in a hoodie with a coffee cup, having done nothing wrong, needing nothing from anyone, simply existing in a space he had every right to occupy. That conversation is still running. The body camera, for now, is the best tool we have for making sure it stays on the record. If this story made you think, if it made you consider what achievement protects and what it doesn't, what the camera catches and what still slips past it, what changes when the evidence is undeniable and what stays exactly the same, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like Kendrick Moore's exist because someone kept their composure long enough for the body camera to finish its job. We tell them because the people who don't have federal credentials and settlement resources deserve to have their stories on the record too. If you want more stories about racial profiling, police accountability, and the people who refuse to let the record be rewritten, hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and tap the notification bell so you never miss a video. We post stories exposing racial profiling and the moments when the system was forced to answer for itself. Every story is documented, every one matters, and we are nowhere near finished.